My neighbor blocked my garage with his new shed and claimed, it's not a big deal. Furious, I took him to court, and when he was ordered to tear it down, his tantrum left everyone laughing. I knew my neighbor, Dave, was a nightmare from the start. The day he moved in, he blasted music so loud my windows rattled. He parked his beat-up truck partly on my lawn. He let his dog run wild and never cleaned up after it. The man had no respect for anyone. But what really pushed me over the edge? Dave built a massive shed directly in front of my garage. Not off to the side. Not near it. Right. In front of it. At first, I thought maybe it was temporary. Maybe he was just storing it there for a day or two. But as the days passed and the shed stayed put, I realized he had no plans to move it. I went over and knocked on his door. "Hey, Dave," I said, keeping my tone polite. "I noticed you put that shed in front of my garage. I can't get my car out. You mind moving it?" He looked at me like I had just asked him for a kidney. "Yeah, I know," he said with a shrug. "It's not a big deal." I blinked. "It is a big deal. I can't use my garage." He laughed like I was overreacting. "Come on, man. You barely use it anyway. Just park on the street." I stared at him. "That's not the point. You can't block my property like that. The shed is literally on my land." He waved a hand. "Nobody cares about that stuff. It's just a shed. Relax." Then he shut the door in my face. I stood there, stunned. Who does that? Who just decides they can take over someone else's space like it's nothing? I tried reasoning with him again a few days later. I brought my property documents and showed him the clear boundary lines. He barely glanced at them. "Dude, I already set everything up," he said, annoyed. "I'm not moving it now. Just let it go." I told him I'd have to report it. He laughed. "Go ahead. They won't do anything." Challenge accepted. I filed a complaint with the city and sent in photos of the shed blocking my garage. Within a week, an inspector came out to take a look. He didn't even need to measure. The shed was blatantly illegal, too close to my house, partially on my property, and completely blocking access to my garage. Dave got an official notice, move the shed within 30 days or face fines. His response? He crumpled up the paper and threw it on the ground right in front of the inspector. Yeah, not happening. So the city fined him. He ignored it. They fined him again. He ignored that, too. After the third fine, I saw him outside one day, pacing around the shed and grumbling to himself. I walked over. "You gonna move it?" I asked. He shot me a glare. "Nah. They can't make me." I just smiled. Okay. Because what Dave didn't realize was that I wasn't just waiting around for the city to handle it. I was taking him to court. I gathered every piece of evidence I could, photos of the shed blocking my garage from multiple angles. Copies of the property deeds showing he had built on my land. Records of the fines he ignored. Statements from neighbors who had also dealt with his nonsense. The court date came fast. I showed up in a suit with my lawyer and a stack of documents. Dave. He strolled in wearing cargo shorts and a hoodie, chewing gum like he was bored out of his mind. The judge barely had to hear the case before making a decision. "Mr. Davis, you are in clear violation of property regulations. You are ordered to remove the shed immediately and pay damages to your neighbor for obstruction and property encroachment." Dave's jaw dropped. "This is stupid. It's just a shed." The judge wasn't impressed. "You have 30 days to remove it, or the city will remove it at your expense." Dave stormed out, muttering curses under his breath. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next morning, I was woken up by loud crashing noises. I looked outside. And there was Dave, ripping apart the shed like a madman. But he wasn't doing it the smart way. Instead of taking it apart piece by piece, he was attacking it. He kicked the metal walls. He yanked at the beams with his bare hands. He threw pieces of wood across the yard, screaming. At one point, he grabbed a sledgehammer and started swinging wildly. A few neighbors came outside to watch. Some even brought coffee. Then karma struck. First, he stepped on a rusty nail and let out a scream. Then, he smashed his own foot with the sledgehammer. And for the grand finale, the entire roof collapsed on top of him. By the time he crawled out, limping and covered in dust, people were laughing. One neighbor actually started clapping. Dave stood there, panting, his face bright red. And I just stood on my porch, sipping my coffee, enjoying the show. But Dave wasn't done yet. Dave didn't say a word after his legendary tantrum. He just stomped inside, slamming the door so hard it rattled his windows. I figured that was the end of it. He'd been humiliated in front of half the neighborhood, destroyed his own shed, and was out hundreds, if not thousands, of dollars. That had to be enough, right? Nope. Dave wasn't done being an idiot. A few days later, I came home from work to find a brand new problem. He hadn't rebuilt the shed. He'd put up a fence. And not just any fence, a massive, ugly, 7-foot wooden fence that stretched right across my driveway. I stood there in complete disbelief. I walked up to it, ran my hands along the rough wood, and just stared. My garage was technically accessible now, but the fence was so close to the entrance that I couldn't actually pull my car in. I marched straight to his door and knocked, hard. Dave answered with a smug grin. "Oh, hey there, neighbor. What's up?" I took a deep breath. "Move the fence." He shrugged, all casual. "It's on my property." I clenched my fists. "No, it's not. It's blocking access to my garage. You know that." Nah, looks fine to me." He gave me a lazy smile. "Besides, the shed's gone. Isn't that what you wanted?" I stared at him. This wasn't just about being difficult anymore. Dave had lost the shed battle. Now, he was trying to win the war. I didn't say another word. I just turned and walked away. I was done trying to reason with this clown. Time to really make him pay. The next morning, I called the city inspector. Again. They sent someone out the same day. He took one look at the fence and sighed. "This guy again?" I nodded. "Yeah. Him again." Turns out, Dave had once again violated multiple zoning laws. The fence was too close to the property line. It was too tall. And, most importantly, it was blocking legal access to my garage. The inspector wrote him another violation notice right there on the spot. Later that evening, I sat on my porch with a beer and watched Dave storm out to his mailbox. He grabbed the letter, opened it, and immediately started screaming. He kicked over a lawn chair, threw the letter on the ground, and stomped back inside. The next day, he was back at City Hall, trying to fight it. And guess what? He lost. Again. The city gave him 2 weeks to take the fence down. If he refused, they'd fine him every single day until it was gone. But instead of just admitting defeat, Dave did something even stupider. He doubled down. A week passed. The fence. Still up. The fines. Piling up. Then, one night around 2 a.m., I was woken up by the sound of hammering. I groggily got out of bed and peeked through my curtains. And there was Dave, outside, in the dark, with a flashlight strapped to his head, reinforcing the fence. I actually laughed out loud. This dude was so desperate to win that he was out here in the middle of the night, adding extra support beams to a fence that was already illegal. But fine. If that's how he wanted to play, I had one last move. I went back to City Hall the next morning with a new complaint. This time, I didn't just report the fence. I reported his entire property. His front yard was a disaster, old car parts, rusted tools, piles of random junk. His backyard. Overgrown and filled with trash. He had at least 2 abandoned vehicles in his driveway. And, the best part, his house. Multiple structural violations. If Dave wanted to make my life hell, I was going to burn his entire world down. I sat back and waited. And then, 2 days later, the city inspector showed up. I was sipping my morning coffee when the first city truck pulled up. Then another. Then another. By noon, there were 4 city officials on Dave's property. One was measuring the illegal fence. One was taking photos of his junkyard of a front lawn. One was writing up violations for the cars. And the last guy. He was walking around the house, making notes. Dave was losing his mind. He came outside, waving his arms. "What the hell is this? You can't do this." The inspector didn't even look up. "Sir, you've ignored multiple violations. We're here to document everything for further action." Dave turned bright red. "Further action? What does that mean?" The inspector looked at him, dead serious. "It means if you don't fix these issues, your property may be condemned." Dave went completely silent. And I just smiled. Because finally, after months of dealing with his nonsense, I knew his nightmare was just beginning. After the city inspectors left, Dave went into full panic mode. For the first time ever, I saw him actually trying to clean up his property. He spent the next few days running around his yard, tossing random junk into garbage bags, cursing under his breath the entire time. He tried to push one of his broken-down cars onto the street, but it wouldn't start. At one point, I saw him literally kicking the engine like that would somehow fix it. And the fence. Still up. At this point, the fines were stacking up. Every day he refused to remove it, the city slapped another penalty on him. I could see the stress on his face every time he checked his mailbox. Then came the bombshell. A week later, a certified letter arrived at his house. He ripped it open right there on his porch. I watched as his eyes scanned the paper, his expression shifting from confusion to pure panic. Then, he actually screamed. I mean a full-on, red-faced, hands in the air, raging at the sky scream. I knew exactly what had happened. The city had officially escalated his violations to legal action. He wasn't just facing fines anymore, he was facing potential property seizure. And it got even worse. A few days after the meltdown, I noticed something new, a different car parked in his driveway. A clean, black sedan. Not Dave's style at all. Then, two men in suits knocked on his door. Dave answered, looking exhausted. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair was a mess, and he had the look of a man who hadn't slept in days. I couldn't hear the full conversation, but I caught bits and pieces. Loan default. Foreclosure proceedings. Final notice. Oh. Dave wasn't just dealing with the city anymore. His mortgage lender was after him, too. Turns out, all those fines. They weren't just a slap on the wrist. They were adding up fast. And since Dave had ignored them for so long, the city had the legal right to put a lien on his house. Which meant that if he didn't pay up, the bank could step in and take everything. For the first time since this all started, Dave wasn't acting smug anymore. He was desperate. That night, he knocked on my door. I opened it and saw a version of Dave I had never seen before, nervous. Hey, He scratched the back of his head. So, listen. I think things got a little out of hand. I crossed my arms. Oh. You think? He forced a laugh. Yeah. Look, man, I might have been a little stubborn. But we're neighbors, right? No hard feelings. I stared at him. This was the same guy who blocked my garage, ignored court orders, and laughed in my face when I told him to move the shed. Now he wanted to play nice. Dave, I said flatly, what do you want? He shifted on his feet. So, I was wondering if you could maybe, talk to the city for me. Let them know this was all just a big misunderstanding. I almost laughed out loud. You want me to help you? He nodded, giving me the fakest smile I had ever seen. Yeah, man. Just, neighbor to neighbor. Maybe we can work something out. I took a deep breath. Then, I slammed the door in his face. After that, Dave went into full meltdown mode. He started calling the city nonstop, trying to fight the fines. They weren't budging. Then, he tried selling the house. But here's the problem, who would want to buy a house covered in legal issues? Every time a real estate agent showed up, they took one look at the pending violations and backed out. The bank was breathing down his neck. The city wasn't letting up. His fines were through the roof. And then, the cops showed up. One evening, I heard a loud knock on Dave's door. 2 police officers stood outside. Dave answered, looking completely wrecked. He hadn't shaved in days, his shirt was stained, and his usual smug attitude was gone. The cops spoke to him for a few minutes. Then, I saw them hand him a piece of paper. Dave's face drained of color. He started arguing, his arms waving, his voice rising, but the cops just stood there, letting him rant. Finally, one of them said something that made him stop dead. And then, right there on his own porch, Dave broke down. I watched as he slumped against the doorframe, hands on his head, completely defeated. A few days later, a new sign appeared in his yard. Dave was done. And I finally had my garage back. After the bank-owned property sign went up, the neighborhood breathed a collective sigh of relief. Dave had lost. The house wasn't his anymore. The city had crushed him with fines, the bank had taken his home, and he had no way out. All he had left to do was pack up and leave. I thought, finally. This nightmare is over. I was wrong. Because Dave? He wasn't leaving quietly. About a week after the foreclosure notice, I was out on my porch enjoying a drink when I noticed something odd. Dave's house was still full. No moving trucks. No boxes. He wasn't packing. I should have known right then that something was coming. That night, around 11 p.m., I heard a loud crash from Dave's yard. Then another. Then, laughter. Drunken, manic laughter. I walked to my window and looked outside. And there was Dave, drunk out of his mind, smashing what little he had left. He had taken a baseball bat to his own mailbox. Pieces of it lay scattered on the ground. He staggered over to the fence, the same illegal fence he had fought so hard for, and started kicking it. And then, he turned towards my house. I saw it in his eyes. Rage. Humiliation. Blame. Dave wasn't mad at himself. He was mad at me. Because in his twisted mind, this was all my fault. I stepped outside onto my porch. "Dave," I said, my voice calm but firm. "Go inside. Go to sleep. Don't make this worse." He swayed on his feet, gripping the baseball bat. His eyes were wild. "You think you won," he slurred. "You think you're better than me." I stayed quiet. I wasn't about to play his game. He took a few shaky steps forward, pointing the bat at me. "This is your fault," he growled. "You did this. You and your stupid garage." I clenched my jaw. "You did this to yourself, Dave. I gave you every chance to fix it. You chose this." He let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah. Well, guess what, buddy? If I can't live here, neither can you." And before I could react, Dave swung the bat at my car. The sound of glass shattering split through the air as my driver's side window exploded. For a second, everything went completely still. Then I saw the neighbors coming outside, their porch lights flicking on one by one. I turned back to Dave. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," I said, my voice like ice. And right on cue, red and blue lights flashed down the street. The cops were already on their way. Turns out, one of my neighbors had seen Dave wandering around drunk with a bat and had called 911 before I even stepped outside. The officers pulled up and immediately took control of the situation. Dave tried to play it cool at first. "Oh, come on, it's just a misunderstanding. I was just messing around." Then they pointed to my car's shattered window. Dave froze. And right there, in front of half the neighborhood, they slapped the cuffs on him. The officer read him his rights as he stood there, pale and silent. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. For the first time since he moved in. Dave had nothing left to say. They put him in the back of the cruiser and drove off. The next morning, word spread fast. Dave had been charged with vandalism, destruction of property, and public intoxication. Since he was already in deep financial trouble, his bail was set higher than he could afford. He sat in jail for days. While he was locked up, the bank officially took control of his house. They sent in a crew to clean up the disaster he left behind. The junk, the fence, the debris, all of it, gone. And finally, after months of absolute chaos, Dave was gone, too. I'd like to say I felt happy when it was all over. But really, I just felt tired. I had spent months dealing with Dave's nonsense. Court cases. Fines. Inspections. Sleepless nights wondering what he'd do next. And for what? Because he was too stubborn to admit he was wrong. Too prideful to fix a mistake. Too arrogant to believe he could ever lose. In the end, he lost everything. His house. His money. His freedom. And me. I pulled my car into my garage that night, the same garage he had tried to block with his stupid shed. And just sat there in silence. Because after everything, I finally had my peace.